Yeah, I could see some guitars in the back too. I like that.
Quite a number.
Yes. What are you up to, if you don't mind me asking?
You know what? I sort of lost track because I have some in storage, but probably about 60.
60. Wow, that's amazing. Is that purely guitars or is that basses?
No, that would be guitars. I have a six-string bass. I have a precision bass, a
Nice.
few other instruments, mandolin, banjo, a Russian balalaika, a
Okay,
Turkish,
wow.
uh, and a couple of other things. I forget the name of the Turkish instruments. A bakla something, but I don't want to say it out of turn because I can't recall. It has a little tag on it that it's a name. I got it from my a broker, and he
Okay.
had exotic instruments, and so I loved it. So he just said, "Hey, here for next to nothing, you can have this."
Oh, it's really cool to have some exotic instruments sometimes. Like,
Oh
I, I bought this guitar sitar. It was made by Dan Electro, and I used it one time for one video. But I'm like, someday I'm going to do a video on like there's a Steely Dan solo that has a sitar, and then also the Ain't Talking About Love. There's actually a sitar playing along.
yeah, there's it's on that song called "Do It Again."
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah, Denny Diaz played the sitar guitar solo on that track.
Oh, it's so tasty. Of course, if it's a Steely Dan track, it's going to be good. But wow, that's
Oh,
that's
yeah,
awesome.
that was the first album, believe it or not. That was already
Wow.
very advanced.
Yeah, it's crazy. It seems like some bands are just ahead of their time. I mean, whenever people talk about recording processes, they go back to Steely Dan and they're like, "What did they do back then? How did they get that hi-hat separation?" And they talk about all this deep stuff that I don't know, maybe they're just two geniuses that figured it out, you know?
Well, it's kind of a roundabout way. I mean, they came out of a different scene. They came out of the New York bohemian scene, and they were two songwriters that really didn't want to necessarily have a band.
Mhm.
And
Can't
the
blame them.
band came together as a result of their chemistry and working with guys like Jeff Baxter and so
Mhm.
on and so forth. Then they started working with a network of players. It's always pretty much been Walter Becker and Donald Fagen, and they came up together through the bohemian New York scene. The Blue Note jazz kind of thing was a big deal for them, so they were into that plus R&B,
Mhm.
classic R&B, and then they wanted to be pop songwriters too, but they were kind of sophisticated.
Yeah.
So they didn't have the comfortable niche of like a Carol Kay or Carol King, excuse me, or
Mhm.
somebody like that, or Burt Bacharach. Those are the folks that kind of came out of the pop scene of the '60s. They were a little bit more unusual.
Yeah, I would say it's cool when, real deep musical thinkers get together with hook writers, people that can write like on the pop side of things, and to see how that sometimes makes a deeper side of music more accessible to people. Because I think a lot of people got into jazz through bands like Steely Dan, and I
Oh,
know I did when
definitely.
I was younger. So it's kind of cool that that can work out.
When I talked to Larry Carlton at quite a lot of length about his work with Steely Dan
Hmm.
back in '85, frankly, I
Wow.
mean, where you were born. But anyway, the idea is that in those days, it was like a given that a studio player had to have that background.
Mm.
And there were guys far more even jazz oriented than Larry, like
Wow.
Howard Robbins or Barney Kessel, or these kind of guys. They were in the studios too. But Larry had a niche that was the jazz concept that he transferred over into more of a pop rock thing. And that
Okay.
worked beautifully because the sophistication of Steely Dan's harmonies, plus he knew how to solo like a rock guy.
Yeah, that had to help. I know back in, say, the 80s, there were tons. I love the 80s era pop songs. It seems weird because I'm
Oh,
kind of a rock metal guy, but they would bring in some of the best, these ringers would come in and just lay down. I mean, one glaring example is Eddie Van Halen on Beat It, but
oh,
you'd
absolutely.
have you'd have all these guys come in and just lay down a killer lead, even over like Lionel Richie tracks. I never really noticed till I got older, and it's just cool to go back and hear those people on these recordings.
Yeah, I know those guys are great. One of my good friends was Carlos Rios. Do you know? Are you familiar with his work?
No.
Oh, you should check out his work on an album called Brother to Brother.
Okay.
That's a fantastic. It's a pop album, and the hit off of it, you'd never know there was guitar on the rest of the album.
Which hit?
It was called "I Just Want to Stop."
Okay, that sounds
Kind
familiar.
of a pop, kind of a power pop ballad. Kind of a like reminiscent slightly of the Chicago ballads of the '80s. Kind of
Gotcha.
that harmonies were a little richer, but Carlos just soloed brilliantly. And I mean, it's like that's jazz rock over a pop thing to taken to the nth degree.
Oh, it could be so beautiful. I remember, I grew up on Karate Kid and hearing Peter Cetera. That got me into Chicago. It's funny how you find your ways to these bands eventually, but sometimes it's through unexpected means.
Right. You should listen to the track, the title track, Brother to Brother, and his guitar work on it is something else. Then you'll go and listen to the other few tracks on there that have like prominent guitar. And
Okay.
I think you'll be impressed.
I really love the fact that at my age, I feel like I've heard so much, but at the same time, I just did an Aerosmith video on the making of Pump. I just basically did a review of that old documentary, and
Great.
I learned all this stuff. There's just so many layers to people and to bands and to stories, and I just love that kind of stuff. And that's why when I saw your name my entire life on transcription books and magazines and everything like that, I thought it'd be so incredible to talk to you because I don't know if you know, I have a series where I do like a bad tab series because way back in the day, it was real hard to find good tab. But one of the first books I ever got in my whole life was this one.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And there's your name
I
right
remember
there.
it well. I
And,
remember it well.
and this one, I would love to hear anything you want to say about transcribing this, but it taught me more about guitar than almost anything because back in the day I didn't have a teacher at first. I'd had no internet obviously, and I sat at my dad's trailer house one day because we would go there every other weekend, and I just learned D just from the tab book, and it taught me so much. So first of all, I want to thank you for everything
Oh,
you've
my
done in my
pleasure.
life for that. Yeah, so I mean that book changed my life literally. So I was wondering, do you remember a lot about the transcription process? And beyond that, I wanted to also commend you for being, out of all the transcribers back then, you seem to be ahead of the curve. It's like your transcriptions always seem way more accurate than, let's say, some of the other ones that I've come across.
Well, how would you like me to start that story that would lead towards Randy Rhoads tribute?
Is there a backstory? Of course there is, but is there
You
anything you want
love
to
a
say about
backstory.
working your way into being able to transcribe for books like
Oh,
that?
sure, sure. I mean, it's stages like anything else. It has a lot to do with your opening background of your life, like what happened in your life. And I was always around music since I was born.
Mhm.
My mom was a classical pianist, and the way she babysat me was throw me on a big comforter blanket under the grand piano, and she practiced for hours so she wouldn't have to keep an eye on me crawling around somewhere.
Wow.
And that's how she trained my ear. I always tell people that the way I learned to decipher notes and things and chords was because I heard her practice very complicated classical music, Chopin, Rachmaninoff, very elaborate, some Tchaikovsky pieces, Beethoven. She would at Franz Liszt. She practiced these very complicated things, and every once in a while she practiced them. She'd be going fast. She'd be shredding on the acoustic piano, and next thing you know, I flubbed a note. She went back and fixed it. So I started to hear how you could fix
Oh.
what's the right way to go, what's the wrong way, and you start to get the sense of pitch sensitivity. You develop what's I call relative pitch,
Hmm.
different from absolute pitch or perfect pitch.
Right. Well, I mean, people who have perfect pitch sometimes say it can be a little bit of a curse too, like a double-edged sword. Have you heard that?
Oh yeah, well, if you hear something tuned to E flat,
Yeah.
or it's between E flat and E, like some rock records are sort of like what Eddie tuned down. It's not a
Hmm.
perfect flat. It's closer to E flat than anything else,
Right.
but he didn't have an electronic tuner per se, like clip-on type. He used a big old Peterson strobe tuner like everybody used in those days,
Yep.
and it might drift a bit.
Hmm.
Plus his guitar's equal temperament, so he would compensate. So it's perfect pitch is mathematical.
Okay. I don't know.
And
I feel like if I had that, I wouldn't be able to listen to like Pantera. Like you said, it's just
yeah,
detuned a little bit.
yeah, and some records are actually slowed down or sped up a little bit to make them a better pop song.
Mm, I heard.
Transcribing way back in the old days, Joe Pass, a great album that I was very important to me called For Django. It's a heavy guitar album, it's just two
Mhm.
guitar players, bass and drums. I mean, and he played all the solos. Joe Pass, all the heads and the
With,
solos. He
with
had
with
great
two
guitar.
fingers? No, I'm just kidding.
No, that's Django Reinhardt you're thinking
Yeah.
of.
So the album was for Django. Was it for Django
For Django,
Reinhardt? Okay,
yeah, it was his
gotcha.
tribute to Django. He was doing a lot of Django tunes. Plus, he also wrote a tribute song to Django called Four Djangos. That's where the album came from. They were tunes that he did, Django did, or they were dedicated to him, like the tune Django
Hmm.
itself was a modern jazz quartet song that he adapted to guitar, bass, two guitars and bass and drums. With that one, it was actually sped up. So when I transcribed it, it was in G flat. I thought, wow, that's a weird key to do
Oh,
that in. And
strange.
then when I actually played on stage with the guitarist that played behind Joe,
Hmm.
yeah, we actually played that song. I said, "What's the deal with that? Why was it in that key?" He said, "Oh, that's not a key. We played it in F." They sped it up.
And it happened to be exactly a half step up, huh?
It was as close to it as possible. I don't
Wow.
know exact. I mean, again, that's not with mathematical precision. Since there was no piano involved,
Right. That
it
makes
was two
sense.
guitars, bass, and drums.
There was a Testament book one time that I bought. I'm all about tab books because, like I said, that's how I learned. And in one of the songs, it says, on this song, you have to tune your guitar up a half a step. So you have to tune it. Isn't it strange? Have you ever heard of that before? Like a rock guitar player tuning to F for anything?
Well, I don't find rock guitars doing as much, but certainly there's a lot of alternate tunings among folk
Mm-hmm.
and people that are, usually like Michael Hedges and whatnot.
Sure.
Guys like that really got into the real specifics of interesting tunings. They might do something like that. And some
Okay.
old blues players just tune their guitars depending on how it work with their voice.
I've seen people do that. People, just the old school people, they just start turning that E string and they feel it, and when it sits right, then they tune the rest of it to it. I always respected that. I can't do that because I do so much studio stuff. It would drive everybody crazy, but I like that.
Yeah, it's part of the medium of when you're like a self-contained act. When you're
Exactly.
your own accompaniment, you can pretty much do whatever you want behind that.
Yeah, if you're Jack White or something and you only have a drummer in your band, you could do whatever you want, pretty much. So.
Well, probably. I mean, within getting back to the story, if you wanted me to continue,
Yes.
is that uh, I developed that sensitivity, what I call pitch sensitivity, early on, pitch and chord sensitivity, but I didn't know how to really do it per se as a transcription process. So that was built up gradually with me learning to read and write music. And then I realized reading and writing music for piano was different than the guitar.
Yep.
And
Oh
you go through
man.
all these transformations. So it was a series of steps. I mean, I studied very carefully classical music for a while. I studied jazz guitar, and that's some of the first things I actually transcribed and wrote down. So I
Wow.
was writing down harder than average pieces. And by the time I had gotten through the period of what I would call my apprenticeship, a very important guy for me was Pat Martino
Hmm.
because he encouraged me to transcribe. I gave him some of my transcriptions when we first met, and we just stayed friends forever. In fact, he signed, did a great endorsement for the back of my book. He's a
Oh
very
wow.
well known jazz guitarist. Yeah, he'd be considered like one of the jazz guitar shredders.
Okay. I like that.
He's one of those types of fellows. Anyway, the idea is that he encouraged me to do that, and I did hundreds of pages of transcribing pretty complicated material. And at one point, he said, "Okay, I'm going to have you do all the sheet music lead sheets for my copyright of my two Warner Brothers albums." So
Wow.
that was a segue into the professional world of preparing music for publication.
Hmm.
And that went into the Library of Congress, so that had to be written like very carefully.
Okay, the official copy.
Yes, that's right. If you went to the Library of
Wow.
Congress, opened up their files, whatever it's on some sort of computer now, probably, you'd
Hmm.
see those transcriptions written down with my penmanship because I
Oh
did it all by
wow.
hand. There was no
Yeah.
computer software. You had to do it all by hand.
Oh, how tedious was that?
No, it's great because I loved calligraphy, and
Okay.
it was just like one of the things I do. And at some point, I could even send you a score or two for you to see what that early calligraphy looked like when I did it by hand.
Yeah, that would be cool to see that.
What I was going to do also is let you know that I was working a lot in that period at the Musicians Union as a recording guitar player, touring guitar player, and all that stuff. So one of the gigs that you do when you weren't on the road or in the studio was what they called takedown, which is transcribing a lead sheet to be prepared for studio sessions.
Okay.
So somebody would bring you a cassette in those days to drop it off in your mailbox or whatever, and I'd pick it up, and it would have to be written out with parts, within the next couple of days. So that was just something you do, and people with ears and who could write for guitar, because they have to write for guitar. You're just writing a piano score is not good enough, because they
Sure.
guitar players and drummers and bassists, so that they don't oftentimes read piano scores.
Right. Did you have to put a lot of chords, or was it actual notation where, because I don't know how many people would sight read at that time, right?
No, they did in studios.
Okay.
Sure, I came into the studios much later than Larry Carlton and all those guys. So there was a lot of guitar players reading Lee Ritenour, Tommy Tedesco, all those players that were in that scene. They were all reading music, not the real idiomatic guitar music. More like what Lukather did was different because he was brought in oftentimes as a specialist.
Okay. Yeah.
And he had an open solo. Luke, play on this track,
Okay. Freedom.
and they bring he feel his way around. And we all did a lot of those sessions. He just did absolutely the top of the line. You
Yeah,
know,
I've done a few of those. It's a lot of pressure because you really have to bring the magic, right away. So,
yeah, and you have to kind of know the style. I remember doing rockabilly sessions. You kind of had to get your head around doing rockabilly when Stray Cats first came out. Everybody thought they would jump on the rockabilly bandwagon.
oh
So you had
yeah,
to have the instrument, the right kind of amp, the whole deal. And then other times you'd need a Strat,
right.
and it would be more of a clean rhythm, funky thing. And then
Hmm.
other times it'd be like a hard rock guitar solo. It'd be a 335 or a Les Paul. I used a Mesa Boogie a lot of times in the studio because they couldn't handle a big Marshall a lot of times for sessions. Luke got him to do that, but all
Okay.
the other guys bring in smaller amps like Larry or Lee Ritenour or Jay Graydon. Those guys all brought in Fender Deluxes and stuff.
Yeah, I can't imagine Steve or saying no to Steve when he's wheeling in his half stack or something.
He's proud of the fact that he was the first guy that got that stuff on pop dates.
I'd be proud of that too.
Yeah. And after that, people started wanting that. I
Hmm.
remember doing a session in the '90s, 10 years or so after Lukather established that, and I came in with a little combo amp that had a great distorted sound in my Les Paul, and they said, "No, we want to see the Marshall. We want the
Oh,
Marshall
wow.
in the."
Times have
Yeah,
changed then.
we put it in an ISO room and all that stuff, and it was a special thing. And I couldn't even get him to use like an amp that was a simulated Marshall. He
Okay.
wanted the Marshall stack turned all the way up.
Wow. The old ACDC, huh?
It was just yeah, it was a modified JCM 800.
Okay.
So that was yeah, it was that type.
Dang. I still love that. And I had a gig recently where I brought my half stack and I looked on stage. It was kind of this jam session and everybody else had modelers. So nobody even had a speaker on the stage. I felt like an old band. So it's funny how it's kind of come full circle.
I had to do that. I had to use my modeling amp when I went direct doing a show like it was kind of like a Broadway show, so you can't really have a loud amp because right next
Sure.
to you is a horn player with
Hmm.
a mic. So you can't do that. So it had to be direct going into the house, and
Yep.
you'd have to wear headphones when you're reading music. That was with Burt Bacharach when I was in his group for about 2 months doing his show. So
Wow.
when we were doing that, that had to be a certain thing, because you'd need a rock sound, and then you'd have to switch. You'd play acoustic, and then you'd put that down. You'd need a Strat, or you'd need the fatter humbucker sound. So you had like two guitars, and they'd all be, signed going through your modeling amp because you couldn't
Mhm.
possibly switch it out with a Marshall. You could have a roadie back there doing that.
Feedback coming out and everything. That'd be crazy. Yeah, it's
Well,
it's amazing nowadays how much you can control stage volume. I mean, a lot of drummers are
yeah,
playing those V drum kits, and I think
sure.
it's hard to go anywhere without seeing somebody using a V drum kit or a modeler anymore. So I think it's just it's good for certain situations. I'm kind of old school though. I love the speakers on stage, feedback, and all that stuff. But of course, your hearing suffers after a while.
Yeah, you have to be careful of your hearing.
Yep.
So don't blow it out, please.
Yeah, I've had one incident with my left ear that got funny because I wore one earbud one time because I was trying to figure out the rock and roll solo by Zeppelin, and it's like in one speaker, and I slowed it down, and all that static and stuff made my ear go half deaf for like 6 months. It was the scariest thing. And now to this
Months.
day, if I plug this ear, everything goes up a quarter of a step in pitch in this ear.
Kidding. That's an unusual phenomenon.
Yeah, it's kind of a scary thing, but if I let this ear, open up, then my brain figures it out. But I kept thinking, what if for the rest of my life I hear everything dissonant because one ear is hearing a different thing?
Yeah,
That'll
right.
drive you
Step
crazy.
apart.
Yes, binaural beats everywhere I go. Yeah, so you started off with real heavy hitters, And so when you got to the rock world, did it almost seem easy?
Oh, I started with the rock world.
Oh, you did. Okay.
Oh, yeah, no, when I was in high school, I was playing all the Eric Clapton, Hendrix stuff.
Oh, gotcha.
I was not interested in jazz. I didn't even know about jazz. I mean, I love the sound of all music. So I was intrigued by Joe Pass and Howard Roberts and Wes Montgomery and Kenny Burrell. Those were like the guys I listened to, but I couldn't make heads or tails. I wanted to learn, Jimi Hendrix,
Sure.
Eric Clapton with Cream, Blues Breakers. That was the
Yep.
stuff when I was a kid. And it was just heavy blues rock. And that's it. I mean, Les Paul, that was my sound for many, many years,
Okay.
at least 4 years until I met guys that kind of, it was a period where I started gravitating towards jazz. And that was a very lucky thing for me because I learned all my other skill sets. That band breaking up it was very helpful to me that the band broke up. It was a teenage band and we
Yeah.
were on our way to some cool stuff around Hollywood. It's easy, if you're playing that kind of music and you're playing it with some finesse, nobody else was doing it. When we were playing those clubs, we had Jim Morrison coming in and watching us play from
Really?
the door. Yeah, and guys
Wow.
like Springfield and stuff. These guys, it was a Sunset Strip. Everyone played the Sunset Strip. It was just cool. I mean, this possibility you might see Jimi Hendrix walking down the street or
That's
Brian Jones and
crazy.
the Stones or something. It was
Yeah.
just a scene. I was so lucky to grow up in that scene and to be around it. I mean, I got to see Cream at the Whiskey when there was like 30 people in the room from my seat of their stack and Clapton's guitar close up and everything. That was just from that night. I
I
got to see
feel
Jeff, Rod Stewart, and all that stuff. Those are like my heroes.
so when you're on stage and you know Jim Morrison's watching or whatever, how does that feel?
I didn't
Okay.
know it. My rhythm guitar player was. We used to do this thing. We used to do a heavy blues thing, and we went trio like Cream. And so the rhythm guitar player went off stage, and we just did a real long blues, and that's what Morrison liked. So he was at the bar drinking, and my rhythm guitar player sat right down next to him and said, "Hey, Jim Morrison's here today." He told me later that night. He said at one point he was getting so wound up he fell off the bar stool.
I thought you were gonna say he got crazy and went on stage and just started jamming with you guys. That would have been crazy.
He was kind of in the background.
Okay.
But it was because Gazzari's. I don't know if you ever know much about Gazzari's. That's when Van Halen played a lot and stuff.
Okay.
It was a classic club on the Sunset Strip. There was like the Galaxy, Gazzari's, Whiskey A Go Go, Pandora's Box, and a couple of other places that were on Sunset Boulevard. And all the bands played there, and all the guys who were in town. If like Hendrix was in town, he'd be going there to check out what's happening, or Jim Morrison would check out what's happening, or anybody, anybody that was around. That was where they went.
Man, what a scene. That must have been incredible. I mean, did you say you
Yeah.
have some kind of autobiography or anything? Are you working on one? Because these stories would be crazy to read about.
I should do that. A lot of my students, when we get to talking about this stuff, ask me about that. What was that like? It's all bits and pieces. It probably, if I put the whole thing together, it'd be fairly interesting because
Yeah.
how did this kid from, classical music, picking up rock guitar by ear, why did he get into transcribing and, doing all this
Right.
other stuff, right?
Yeah.
It just seems to be a strange pathway, but it is kind of different. So,
Just
I've just been fortunate to be where I was when I was growing up.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it has to do with circumstances, but I really love the story about you under the piano, just really feeling
Yeah.
the vibrations, training your ear without even knowing it. And then somehow, when you first started transcribing, did you say you started with rock or jazz and then eventually.
Well, no, rock, I never, here's the thing. There's two levels of transcribing. And one level is you pick it up by ear and you can play it perfectly, but you never write it down. Most people who learn by ear, whether it's Van Halen learning I'm So Glad by Eric Clapton or Brian May learning something from Eric Clapton, they never wrote it down. There was no need. They
It's all
internalized
up
it. They
here.
just
Yep.
played it every day. It became part of their whole motor skill set.
Right.
They hear a blues chord, boom, I'm going to play that Clapton lick. End of story. There's
Yep.
no doubt, and then they'll do some variation on the theme. But that's one level of transcribing, and I did that from the get go. Like I said, I was playing these Cream songs; those were all transcribed. There was no sheet music for that. You had to learn those exact solos from "Sunshine of Your Love" or something like that, or I'm So Glad, or any of those, Cat Squirrel, whatever they were. We played them, and then the Blues Breaker stuff was even more complex because the solos were more involved. So yeah, so that's one level. And then I started writing it down. Like I said, after I got into jazz, I started wanting to notate and document it. And so
Gotcha.
there's a period of about 7 or 8 years before I did any published transcriptions.
So, did you have to do the old school record needle, bring it back, listen? Okay, because I
Yeah.
was wondering if you had cassettes at the time or what you used.
No, the cassettes would have been a little bit more advanced. What I had was a reel-to-reel recorder.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
Transferred it because I ruined so many records. I just bought a record and I played it and I just let it play into the tape machine. And then
Sure.
I'd go back and that would be stop and start and stop and start. I wore out a lot of tape decks too.
I bet. Were you able to slow it down so you could maybe bring it down an octave? Okay.
Oh yeah. In fact, later on, I had this trick that was just before I got into the digital recording. I was using the same machine that everyone mastered their records on. It's a very fancy 2 track
Hmm.
made by Techniques called the 1500.
Oh, the
And
techniques. Yep.
it's like what Toto 4 was mastered on. I mean,
Wow.
it's everybody used prior to DATs.
Okay. Is that a
Because,
quarter-inch tape?
yeah,
Okay.
but it's at 30 IPS.
Okay.
So when you do 30 inches per second, and the average, let's say it averages 7.5. So you have 7.5, 15, and then 30.
That's a big jump.
So you record it at 30 with really great fidelity because the tape is moving so fast. It's really good quality. So when
Mhm.
you slow it down to 15, the quality's still good, even though the octave was dropped.
Interesting. That must have helped a lot at the time to
Oh yeah,
transcribe.
absolutely. It was a 3 speed. It had, like I said, 30 IPS, 15, and then 7.5. And 7.5 was the average home reel to reel. Then they went down to 3 3/4 like a cassette.
Wow, that's
Kind of
crazy.
what the home tape recorder was. Like if you bought one, they used to have tape recorders before cassettes. People had them as part of their stereo systems.
Oh, they
You
did.
actually bought pre-recorded reel to reels and put them on a machine. It's like a record.
You know what? I see 8 tracks a lot, like the kind that like my dad would have in his Chevy or something, a big clunky 8 track cassette thing.
Yeah.
But I don't. It must have been strange to buy a reel of like Clapton. Is that how they came? It was just like a
I
reel
don't
box.
think at that time they might have had some like that, but I think it was mostly earlier than that. They might have
Okay,
had some early Beatles stuff and stuff like that on that, but they already kind of were going towards pretty much just long playing records and then going off into cassettes. By the late '60s, it was already getting to be cassettes.
gotcha. I didn't know cassettes were in the '60s. That's amazing.
They were high end. I had one for sure in 1971.
Okay,
So I know I didn't just have the first one.
sure,
They were around. It had to be at least a couple of years before I got it because otherwise they'd be unaffordable for a
sure.
kid.
It's wild how that works. My grandma had one of the first CD players of anyone I ever knew. She's always ahead of her time. And
Uh-huh.
I remember they paid almost $1,000 for the CD player itself, and then every CD was super expensive. She wouldn't let us touch it, She's like, "Don't touch those; it's lasers and stuff." And so
Right.
I love the advancement of technology with recording. But for you, how does it feel now? You could jump on YouTube and get isolated tracks. You could slow it down. Is it just make you laugh how easy things are these days?
It's funny you should mention that, Mike, because I was thinking about doing a little piece that would actually be the history of transcription machines because I have my very first slow-mo record player.
Wow, really?
Apex record player that had the slow mo. You could get manually take it down gradually, not just
Okay.
clunk, 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 not just presets. You could dial it in.
Oh, wow. Tune it.
So you could tune it down, not an octave, but 2 steps.
Wow,
And it was
really?
80% that you could get it. I mean, it's harder than half speed, but at least it's not just sound like a bass guitar.
Sure.
So I had that early on. So I was going to show that and then go to the reel to reel and then
Hmm.
go to the fancy reel to reel and then go to the early digital slow mos,
Okay, I remember those.
the DAT players.
Yeah, the DAT
Panasonic
machines.
3500 was the
Okay.
fancy one. And then there was the other one that had actually a jog wheel so you could like control the digital flow.
Had one of those before. Yeah, I remember the sound of the music as it's going, fast forwarding digitally. It was such a strange sound at the time.
Yeah, you were like scrubbing.
Yeah. It's like, and I'm like, this is a cool effect. But do you remember the old the old 4 tracks. I used to have a Tascam 4 track that had the speed wheel, and if I think if you brought it all the way down, it was an octave, and that helped me learn a lot of riffs. When I couldn't afford tab books.
The Porta Studio kind of thing. Prior,
Porta
there
Studio.
was a bigger, like a large Porta Studio, and then there was the actual cassette Porta Studio.
Yeah, I had the cassette one, the home one that was like the 424, I believe. That thing was just made my life just awesome for a few years.
I went through every device that was possible.
Yeah.
Luckily, there was a thing in Hollywood called the recycler.
Uh huh.
Are you familiar with that?
No. Oh wait,
It
a
was a
magazine?
Yeah, it was like a little newspaper,
Okay.
and it would have all these deals. People want to meet people, and other people want to sell equipment and cars and whatever jewelry. That's how Metallica met, through the recycler.
That's where
But
I've heard of
anyway,
it.
yeah, oh yeah, it's well known. It's like everybody, like probably Eddie looked through. Yeah, let me see what kind of deals there are on Strat parts, stuff like that. But anyway, the point is everybody used it, and in there was like sections where you could buy equipment. So you'd buy like a reel-to-reel deck, top of the line from say 1962. Nobody wanted it. So
Really?
you'd get real high-end tape deck, which probably would have cost you close to $2,000 equivalent money, but it was like $60
Wow. So it's kind
or
of like the
less.
the Craigslist of the time.
Right. Like that,
Okay.
very much like that.
So what did you use to transcribe the tribute album? Was it old school stuff, or did you get into the modern?
That was still the techniques.
Okay.
1500 reel to reel, 30 ips, 15 ips, 7.5.
Oh wow.
So I could get the levels pretty clean. Like I said, I could record it real fast, and then slow it down to half speed is already twice as fast as a regular reel to reel.
Sure. And was this album difficult because it was a live situation? There's crowd noise. There's a lot of stuff going on. Was it any challenges because of that?
You don't hear that much crowd noise. You hear some, but it never masked much.
Okay.
I mean, you could kind of tell what he was doing uh, most of the time. I mean, there are parts of the solo where there was noise over the single guitar part. So
Hmm.
you go, well, but you could tell, you could make judgments based on knowledge of the music and its language. You know that this heavy metal lick tends to go there. It's
Yes.
not going to end on a stranger. So you can kind of presume, even if someone's talking over it, what might have happened that could be slightly masked. But most of the
Yeah.
time, as I remember, it's clean.
Well, I was going to say his tone stands out, so that must have helped a lot to have that mid-range bite to everything he
Yeah.
did. And I always wondered, you mentioned knowing the physical. You didn't really say this, but I know you understand the limitations of a guitar player. And I've seen transcriptions where they want you to do these impossible runs, and suddenly you're at the 22nd fret out of nowhere, and it's like, I wonder how many of these transcribers didn't actually play that style of guitar, because it doesn't seem like they really understand the physical aspect of it.
Well, sure. I mean, I don't think you can effectively transcribe something you don't play. To me, you're going to be missing, especially guitar, because there's so much to do with guitar physical technique
Right.
that it's string instruments, not quite like a keyboard. A keyboard, is much more general and fundamental. Guitar has all these idiosyncrasies that I personally love.
Right.
That's what I love about it. Is all of the things, the nuances of the guitar are tremendous.
Was there anything in the the Suicide Solution solos? I was actually working on that because my whole life I've been trying to master it, but it's a tricky thing. Was there anything in it that you just went, I have no idea how he did that part?
No, I'd seen a lot of people in LA played copying him already by that point.
Oh, you've seen
I
it.
mean,
Okay, yeah.
George Lynch and Warren DeMartini, they all played those kind of licks, and they were all kind of based still on the Van Halen 3 note per string with a slur concept that they probably got from Alan Holdsworth. But
Yeah.
it was kind of a generic thing that all the LA guitar players played that kind of way. I mean, if you're playing that music, you
Sure.
you know a language. Like people who play jazz play certain language that comes out of the horn players or Wes Montgomery. You just
Makes
know
sense.
that style. You're not going to play something that isn't idiomatic to the instrument.
That's really interesting because I didn't think
They
that
would-
you were in the middle of all that stuff. I'm living in Minnesota. I'm this little kid, and I hear it, and I'm just like, well, the first time I heard Eddie Van Halen, my brain exploded. But for you, you're already in that atmosphere, so I guess that makes sense. You already knew it.
I was hearing about Eddie through the underworld of music. He wasn't a big star yet, but he was already playing places like the Pasadena Civic, maybe opening for a band like Montrose or something.
Sure.
Those kind of things. And already he was saying, yeah, listen to this guitar player. And I remember hearing the first time I heard Eruption, it's like, wow, yeah, of course, there's something so special here. It's unreal.
Yeah,
And
you just feel it.
I got into it in a kind of a backdoor way because at that point I'd already been through jazz. I'd been touring with an R&B band that had a number one hit, and so we were, I was in a different scene. I was in the studio scene and the touring backing musician scene, which was hot at the time because there were a lot of touring going on, a lot of
Yeah,
tour support from record companies in
sure.
those days. And so coming into the Van Halen thing, it's like when you go back in the studios, oh, you have to know how to do this.
It's the new thing.
They're going to ask you because it's always that way. Play like Jimmy Page, play like Eric Clapton, play like Van Halen, play like Brian Setzer. I told you about the rockabilly thing. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's frustrating. Everyone suddenly wanted a guitar player to play rockabilly licks.
Wow.
5 years before, you'd never heard of that.
Yeah, it's funny because swing and big band made another resurgence in the 90s. I don't know if you remember that, but it's crazy to see the cycles of musical styles go by. And it's weird because being in a cover band and playing a whole bunch of styles forces you kind of to learn all these different guitar techniques. And I didn't
Yeah.
think of it, but a studio person has that exact same issue. They have to be ready for anything that's popular.
I mean, I remember being 17 years old and having to learn that long Eric Clapton guitar solo from beginning to end on Hideaway from Blues Breakers. I had to play it every night. You get used to
Wow.
doing it. And if you
Sure.
play the solo like Mick Taylor's solo on "I Can't Quit You Baby" from another male album, we just did all that stuff, and you just learned it and played it. It became part of your vocabulary.
Was there a style that you particularly had trouble with because maybe it was something you didn't do all the time, like slide guitar, or was there anything like that that tripped you up?
Not really. I guess the only thing that still to me would be a work in progress for anybody is to try to nail anything authentically like Alan Holdsworth.
Yes,
That
definitely.
is such a personal style. I've heard people play at it, and I've heard a lot of people do sort of good moments here and there. But just to play like him he's one of a kind.
Yeah, my fingers don't stretch that far. I tried, but
Sometimes he only plays things that aren't stretchy. They're so typical. Guitar players, I always used to you watch like people on TV or whatever to see what their fingering looked like
hmm,
because that would help you learn their style. Like
yep.
whether it was Jeff Beck or Eric Clapton or anybody, those kind of people. Even Van Halen, if I could see them, Alan Horst was the one guy I could say seeing him it didn't help.
Made it
It
harder
actually made
actually. I think
you
he's an
know
alien. I think that's the answer to
yeah.
it. But it must have been a very viable market for a while transcribing these rock bands.
Oh
But
yeah,
do you remember the first one you did that was one of the bigger, hair metal or whatever it was that you
yeah.
remember?
I remember the first one I actually did was Michael Schenker.
Oh, really?
That was the first one I did. The Michael Schenker, the part, some of it was UFO and some of it was the new MSG stuff from the first album.
Wow. So that
That
would have
was
been
the one.
1980, 80 something?
Yeah, it would be about 1980 or 81,
Okay.
something like that. See, I was coming out of all that transcription stuff. We dropped a couple pieces of the story, but I got involved with a company named Starlix,
I remember
and
Starlix, yeah.
we did a whole bunch of these 20 licks per booklet. I played all the parts, whether it was copying Eric Clapton or copying Jimmy Page or copying George Benson or copying Lee Ritenour or whoever,
Whoa.
Carlos Santana, and then I wrote out all the licks. And they printed it. They took it to a little, homespun printer, printed up these little booklets, and sent them out with a cassette.
Wow, I still have some of those, I think. I didn't know it was
Yeah.
you playing everything. That's
Yeah.
incredible.
Well, it depends on which ones. Later on, when I got moved on, there were other people doing it because I couldn't. I was under contract, and it was an exclusive contract. I couldn't do that work for other people.
When you'd walk into a guitar center, there'd be a video playing, and I think it said Starlix. Was that the same
Yeah,
company?
yeah. I'll tell you this interesting story. The first official video like that of a rock star doing that was a Starlix video of Brian May.
Oh, really?
It came about in such a strange way. We went to London to do a Starlix cassette on him. Just like, thank God we got Brian May. It's amazing. Let's just do anything with him,
Yes.
right? And we said, well, why don't we just do a video? So we went to the studio. We did a video. That was the first one. It was just seemed like a good idea at the time. I mean, he
If
had
it's
his rigs up there. They brought some cameras. Boom, boom, boom. They just did it, and he was very good. Carlos Cavazo and Steve Lukather and Larry Carlton. And just ball just kept rolling. Albert Lee, whole bunch of
wow.
people.
Yeah, I think I've seen every single one. They're all online now, so it's amazing to go back and watch like an old Yngwie Malmsteen
Right?
or Or the Brian May one was very interesting because he was showing how he did
Yeah,
his delay tricks and all that
right.
stuff. It was incredible.
Exactly. Yeah,
Do you want to see my favorite one?
sure.
You know what? It's not a Starlix, but I think you'll appreciate this. You know what? It is a Starlix. Nancy,
Nancy Wilson.
yes,
Oh, wow.
one of my lifelong crushes. But yeah, I'm in a Heart tribute band actually, so it's like I
Wow.
got this as nostalgia, but I also learned a lot from it. So it's got the
Yeah.
booklet and everything. I love it.
That was after I left the company because I had to start working exclusively for Cherry Lane,
Oh,
which is how I did the Michael Schenker and Randy Rhoads and Van Halen. Actually, they had the copyright print rights for that.
oh, they did. Okay, Cherry
Yeah.
Lane. That. Okay, my subscribers will kill me if I don't ask you this. One of my bad tab books that I did was for "Injustice for All" by Metallica, and a lot of people were talking about. They would bring up your name and they're like, "Wow, I think you really dropped the ball on this book,"
I
and I'm
didn't do
like,
that.
"If yeah, I know." I said, "You know what? I had to. I basically defended you in the comments. I'm like, you know what? There's an introduction by him. He didn't
Right,
transcribe
that's what,
it.
yeah.
Yeah,
That-
it's just
I didn't. I never saw even the transcriptions. They just at that point I was writing introductions for bands that were signed to Cherry Lane.
oh, gotcha.
And the way that there's a fellow in there, a company called Mike Lefferts, who was the head guy in charge of sort of putting projects together that had to do with print.
Mhm.
And he said, after I did Van Halen and after I did Michael Schenker and Randy Rhoads, he said, just have him write a bunch of stuff and just so you can put his name on the cover.
Yeah, exactly. So,
So I did a bunch of those, Faith No More, and like a ton of them. Just they had a ton of bands that they came. It was Guns N' Roses.
that's right. I remember that
Yeah,
one too. Yeah.
the transcribing that was done by another transcriber because at
So
that point they couldn't I couldn't do every book. I mean, there were
right,
just so many.
so much coming out at the time. So was it kind of weird to your name carried so much weight back in the transcribe world? Was it weird to have your name on the front when you weren't sure about the quality of the transcriptions, or was that just out of your hands? You couldn't worry about that.
I couldn't worry about that. A lot of those intros were even articles I had written for Guitar for the Practicing Musician,
Gotcha.
like the one for Guns N' Roses. That was for Guitar for the Practicing Musician, and I think so was Injustice for All.
Okay.
They took that and they said this will make that book even hipper. So let's just do that.
It's become one of the most notorious tab books of all time. Actually,
Yeah,
my
sorry
video.
they at the time they didn't have me do those books. They were trying to get me to do other stuff, other projects. So the Van Halen catalog was big for them. So my whole
Yeah.
thing was if I could do Van Halen, I'd be happy.
Oh man, talk about having your hands full.
I remember meeting with Eddie, and he said, "Yeah, but I want you to do OU 812 first." So that was the thing. In order for me to do Van Halen one, I had to do OU 812, which
You had
is
to work
fine. Don't get me
backwards.
wrong, but I was just dying to do Van Halen one.
Oh man, what was it like meeting Eddie?
That's great. We got along very well. I'd met him before with Starlix
Okay.
because Starlix was trying to get after Brian May. They were trying to court other people, and Brian May knew Eddie, and they
Okay.
were buds. They played together on something called Starfleet, a little indie album that Brian did, and Eddie
Really?
played on it. They even
Okay.
played on a track called Newsbreakers. They're both honoring Eric Clapton. The thing that turned me on was what they were doing.
You guys are all in that circle. I feel like I
Yeah.
missed out on that really golden era, but um, I don't think Eddie ever did any instructionals, right?
No, he never did. He did some interviews later where he went on a program and he brought his guitar and he showed people a few things.
Yeah.
But those you can see those just on
Yep.
like TV shows. They could probably edit them together and make an instructional video.
Possibly. It's weird that the probably the most popular guitarist at the time never really put it down in a method like that. But you're right. When he got older, I think he went on some talk shows and actually did some tapping moves, and
Right,
you know,
right. He demonstrated his licks and played some things, and those would be easy to transcribe because there's no background noise.
definitely. It's
You
just
just
in studio.
direct, and you watch him play. You can see every note.
Can I ask you what your favorite album was to transcribe? Like, where you just had so much fun? Was it the Van Halen stuff, or
Love the Van Halen stuff, of course. That's the one I was wanting to do more than any of the others.
okay?
Not to slight any of the others, but I love doing the Randy Rhoads. The first couple of Randy Rhoads, I did 4 Randy Rhoads books.
Yeah, that's right.
I did 3 for Cherry Lane and then one for a company in England called Music Sales. It's a book called The Original Randy Rhoads,
I've seen
and
that.
it had
Yes.
that was from the early Starlix days when I was still freelancing, and so
Hmm.
music sales had a relationship. They were distributing Starlix in the UK,
Okay.
so and Australia and stuff. So they had me do the same deal, transcribe Randy Rhoads and then do a hit playing on the cassette.
When you found out he passed away, what was that like for you, if you don't mind me
That
asking?
was that was devastating. I remember exactly where I was because somebody asked me that just the other day, and it was, yeah, I was at the airport, believe it or not, waiting to pick somebody up. And in those days, we had our look. I was, kind of in the mode of being an Aussie or in any hair metal band,
Yeah.
which I love that music and the image, and it was all fun. But there was somebody, a girl getting off the airplane, who said, "Oh, you look like somebody that would be interested. There's this guitar player that died. You might know him." And she didn't
Uh,
even know his name was Randy Rhoads. She said, "It's something like Dusty Dan." I said, "Randy Rhoads?" And yeah, I couldn't believe it.
wow,
And it
Dusty
just,
Dan.
yeah, I can never forget that. I mean, I remember having the same kind of experience. I was at a Christmas party when John Lennon got assassinated. It was just like, you look like somebody that might be interested.
Yeah. Well, back then everybody was kind of in cliques. I remember I was in the freak clique, so everyone just thought Metallica when they looked at you. Seems like
Uh,
that's still around, but it's not as prominent. So I don't know. It's kind of interesting that people would look at you and just know what you'd be interested in back then.
well, I mean, we were in the scene. We were in Hollywood. We were playing those kind of bands. I mean, I could send you pictures of the band I
Yeah,
was in, a big red Marshall on stage and
that would
the
be
whole
great.
thing, the car and the whole deal, the spandex pants.
Yep.
The whole thing is like kind of a cross between Bon Jovi and David Lee Roth kind of look.
Yeah, everybody did it. You had to do that back then.
And it's cool. I love that scene, man. It was neat. I enjoyed it. It was fun, and there was a lot of excitement about the music and the whole lifestyle of being that kind of musician was interesting and exciting. But at the same time, I was doing a lot of studio work too. For contractors would still call me to come in and play like a rock solo or a blues solo.
Oh
So it's like an
wow.
interesting dichotomy of things happening.
You walk in with your spandex and you got to play some old Clapton.
I didn't spandex to those sessions.
That would have been great.
It was Kiss calling me or something.
Can I ask you what the change was like when music started to morph into the grunge era? Because that's a big part of my life when it went from metal to hair metal to grunge. Did you see a lot of change in your work, or were you getting more into jazz at the time?
Well, it's funny. I'd had like a full 10 years of doing all that, like you said, that what we call the hair metal or the power pop or whatever you want to call that metal influenced pop music.
Mhm.
And I remember when Guns N' Roses first came out, it was the beginning of a scene changing away from the shred and
Yes.
the look of that kind of the Bon Jovi look was no longer that. It was more like what Guns N' Roses and Slash looked
Yeah.
like.
Sleaze rock, I think they say.
In a way, but in Hollywood, there was a lot of that going on. I taught the guitarist in Faster Pussycat at the time.
Really?
I, yeah, I was giving private guitar lessons, and so I gave a few lessons to people,
Wow.
some quite famous at the time. And so the idea is that that scene, I could see it changing at that time. It was changing away from that hair metal, very structured, very very kind of what I would call formula look,
Hmm. Right.
this looser thing, and it eventually just was going right into grunge. That's the way
Okay.
I see it. Those steps were going already in that direction.
When you were teaching, I mean, that could be a huge part of your autobiography. Don't let me tell you what to do, but to read about some of these famous guitar players and what they were like when they were learning from you, that must have been really interesting.
It's something funny. The real famous ones, I can tell you a few that are fine with me telling you, but
Okay.
a lot of them I have to sign NDAs.
Sure. I'm
They
sure.
didn't want managers thought it was a bad idea if their like hot guitar player was taking lessons, even if it was on something that wasn't in the band. I mean, I never taught Vivian Campbell ever a metal lick, but was interested in modes and stuff, and I showed him some jazz licks one day, and that was just part of the thing. And like I
Wow.
said, the Master Pussycat, there were some other bands and stuff.
How old was he at the time? Do you remember?
He had gotten out of Dio. He was and Whitesnake. He was in this band that he was leading called River Dogs,
Okay.
and a really cool guy. I really like Vivian. If he ever sees this, I just have to say, Vivian,
Yes.
you are always somebody I remember. And he came over one day and he just wanted to know about that stuff because he was very musically curious and he was interested in more things than just metal. His songwriting was really expanding, and
Mhm.
he just wanted all this info. So he felt that one area, and I gave him some examples and showed him some stuff. We ended up playing together for a few hours. It was just fun, you
Wow.
know. House. I lived in Malibu at the time, so he came over with his girlfriend, and uh, you know, it was all good.
Yeah, it's got to be just an endless amount of stories. You know, I taught guitar for over 30 years privately, and I had a few
Wow.
students, make it to the big time. And one of them won't get back to me now. I think he wanted to put all that behind him. He had a big rock star life for a while, touring the world. And I have another one coming in for a podcast pretty soon. So I just love the backstory on some of these guitar players. Good payoff to see these people so successful.
Yeah, it got to the point where even when I met with big name rock stars, when I was doing the interviews for Guitar World, I'd meet with an Ingve, or I'd meet with like I don't know, John Sykes or something, or whoever
Wow.
it would be, Paul Gilbert, different people at different times, Joe Satriani,
Yeah,
uh,
one of my heroes.
Slash.
Hmm.
We just played. We played together. It was just, it was, I was there to give a documentation of certain licks from the period, transcribe them, and kind of do what they called like a lesson, a private lesson with Slash. They would put the headline banner on the top of the
Sure.
guitar, or hot licks from Eddie's newest album, that kind of thing. It was a blast. We go over stuff from the album, and I ask him questions. We get deep. Well, what's that like Eruption? Sort of. Yeah, it's kind of like Eruption. I did this different thing. In fact, Eddie, when he signed his Van Halen one book, said, "This is great, Wolf. Too bad I can't read."
The irony, huh?
He would do tablature.
Yeah, tablature basically must have changed your life when all of a sudden it's
Yeah,
accessible to people. What was that like when tab really took off? Because that must have been late 70s, maybe?
yeah, it was exactly that. When I was first doing Starlicks, I used the same system that they were using in the Led Zeppelin book, where I
Okay.
did a line of a treble clef, and then below it I put the fraction,
I think it's on here.
one above the other, which is say the tab staff, so the book
Hmm.
could be smaller. But it was the system I got from a Led Zeppelin book.
Oh,
I saw it,
interesting.
pretty good idea, and it's better than running a whole tab thing.
Right.
So I thought, let's just do that, and it worked out great for Starlicks, and that evolved into tab. And then, of course, when I got with the real serious publishers, Cherry Lane, then they wanted tab. Sherry Lane was the first, and so obviously Michael Schenker, Randy Rhoads, Ozzy Osbourne, all of that stuff was that way, as well as Van Halen.
Did you have a tab program? Did you do it by hand? What did you use at first?
All by hand in pencil.
Wow, really?
They wanted you set the pencil scores to the publisher. They would do an edit to make sure that things lined up and stuff. Because I imagine some people had really sloppy penmanship,
Sure.
even with pencil. Things don't line up. B2 is over here, the tab is over there, so they had to line. My stuff was pretty clean because I'm used to being. Remember, I told you, professional copyist
Right.
for movie scores and stuff. And
Wow.
transcribing, I'd transcribe something, and then somebody else would say, "Can you take this piano part and make scores out of it?" So trumpet part, saxophone part, drum part. That'd be another gig I did.
Was there ever a time where there was a machine where you could feed in a song and it would transcribe it for you back in the day, or was that
Never.
okay? That's what I thought.
There still isn't something like that.
Okay, that's kind of a thing that people. It was like a rumor. People used to just take the easy way. I'm like, I don't think that was possible.
You could do that if you had a sequenced part on a synthesizer. It could print out, but the guitar is so idiomatic. If you don't have the right fingerings, I don't care what the notes are.
Okay. Well, the other thing that people would speculate on is they would say a lot of transcriptions were terrible, not yours, but the other ones that I was talking about, on purpose to avoid copyright issues. Is that a fallacy
No.
as well?
No, the only time we did have to do some of that with Starlix, because as people got more and more aware of this market, their managers, not the artists so much, but the managers were very, I don't want to say, I want to say almost like they had a certain territory that they didn't want anyone else to encroach upon
Sure.
and publish. It would have just helped sell the record more, actually. If you learned a
Right.
few licks, you maybe want to get the album. So I don't think they ever saw that big picture. But yes, we had to change a few licks. They couldn't be exactly like the one that Eric Clapton played in Blues Breakers. It might be like part Cream and part Blues Breakers. You just have to use common sense. And if you know the language, it's easy to take a lick from I'm on Fire and mix it with a lick from Eruption. It's still going to sound like Eddie.
That makes
It's
sense.
just kind of improvised, right? You just have to know how the parts go together. If you use that great little run from Little Dreamer that he plays, that very cool run, you could have started it with a slightly different thing, but still play that run. So you have to be
That makes
careful. There's gray areas, and they're not going to police it to that extent. If they do, I think they're putting their energies in the wrong place.
Definitely. And they still do that to this day. I mean, my friend Kurt Mitchell would do in the style of, so you can get away with a lot of stuff. But I think when it comes to Starlicks, that makes sense. But what about the actual book transcriptions? Was there ever a time where you had.
That's different. Sherry
Okay.
Lane, Hal Leonard, they own the print rights.
Okay, that makes sense.
For example, you could never get. I've done 4 Beatle books. There's no way you could get that stuff and put it out without them coming after you. They got not only Yoko Ono, but they got teams of lawyers for every artist.
You don't want
Every
Yoko after you.
well, I'm just saying she's very good about looking at John's music and saying what's happening with the way that it's being printed, and all those deals have to go through her, of
Sure.
course. I
Sure.
remember doing the Beatles acoustic book, and she had a lot of input in that. So I
Wow.
remember that quite well. She wanted things rewritten because she didn't. It's not the music, but she wanted the verb, the narrative rewritten, the stories.
Oh, really?
Oh yeah.
Okay, that could be a whole nother podcast. We'll definitely have to get together again someday.
Let me give you this little sample here so
Sure.
that you got this. This course was something that I had been planning to do since I first got interested in jazz, even before the heavy Eric Clapton, Jimi Hendrix phase. I was interested in it. It's just I wasn't had no ability to do it. But so I actually took some lessons with jazz guitarists that are famous: Joe
Okay.
Pass, George Van Epps, Howard Roberts, Johnny Smith, and other folks that were actually having clinics or lessons or something. And Pat Martino showed me a lot of things, and that is all in this book. In addition to things I've transcribed. There's a lot for every musical example. If I bring up a subject, like for instance, oh, I don't know, if I bring in, let me give you this with this one for a second here, just so you can see. Let me switch to this view for a second. Let me
Sure.
switch my PDF out so I can show you a different one, and I will give you a sample of what a page with the transcriptions may look like to you.
Okay.
And that would be this, for instance. Let me go over here so you can see this page. And at the top, you'll notice there are 2 phrases from John Coltrane that I've transcribed and made into guitar tab.
Oh, wow.
So people can learn these complicated John Coltrane licks, which is, believe it or not, one of the ways that Alan Holdsworth learned to play what he played. Because I saw his book. He took me back into his study room when I first met him, and he said, "Here's my workbook. I started this when I was with Tony Williams." And it's
Wow.
all these licks written out and little ideas that he scrawled into this little workbook. It was very cool. But anyway, that's some of the stuff that I transcribed from saxophone. And then below it is a lot of common phrases that you would learn, just like a rock lick, if you want a
Yes.
jazz lick. So it has to do with the vocabulary of how the music works. As
It,
well as that, I also have, if I may switch to a second view for a quick second here,
sure.
I'll show you the other view. And the chords you can see are presented in a way that are very much like what you'd see if you were buying a tab book. See, there's a line of music, a line of tab, you know, it's all
Beautiful.
there. You can it's lined up just like you could learn just like if you were a tab player. And there's
Sure.
some common fingerings above it, like chord shapes before a common song by Metallica or
Mm-hmm.
something. So
Sure.
a lot of my knowledge of not only the jazz world in terms of the vocabulary, but also how to do a book of transcribed material and put that lesson material together with things that I learned directly from the players. That's in this course.
So is the course a book or is it an online resource too?
It's a book. It's a book
Okay.
by Hal Leonard. I'll show it to you once more so you can see the entire cover. And I'll switch to that screenshot again.
Sure.
And I'll scroll a bit so you can see the front cover. And there's the Hal Leonard logo. So there's the book,
I
as you
need
can
this
see.
book.
And then it's also got 2 quotes from my 2 favorite players that were very influential to me. Endorsement from Pat Martino, endorsement from Kenny Burrell
Nice.
on the cover. And then there's what's in there. This is some of the content. There's over 600 audio tracks.
Wow. Is that something on a CD or can you download it somewhere?
It's downloaded.
Gotcha.
Downloadable. It would be several CDs if they had to do that.
I was gonna say that would add to a lot to the production costs, I'm sure.
They haven't done that for quite a while. It's all downloadable music. That's the way of the future. Plus, it allows you to use their player to slow things down.
Sign me up.
It's pretty cool. It's taken me years to do it, and I've been transcribing and accumulating this material in addition to creating the lesson material itself for all the major topics that I've ever encountered in jazz. After that, you can go and you start branching off into maybe unusual forms of jazz,
Sure.
but this is like the core. So that's what I'm hoping to have accomplished with this particular venture. And it's still pretty new. It's only been out about 6 months.
Okay.
So that's
Well,
why I wanted to, your viewers aware of that.
definitely. I mean, I would definitely benefit from a book like that because it looks like, from what I saw, you're laying out licks that almost resemble some rock licks, but are,
Yeah.
jazz enough to get you into that outside world that a lot of rock players want to flirt with, but they're kind of afraid to.
Think of it this way, Mike. Think of it like when you learn a rock solo, you're really learning the licks of a player, you're not really learning any scales.
Yeah, right.
I mean, if they're playing some stepwise motion in a Randy Rhoads, that's not really a scale. He never thought of it that way. It's a run.
Yeah,
Ingve, the same thing. He didn't really think of a scale, even though he played a lot of harmonic minor and Phrygian dominant and Aeolian and all that stuff. You could ascribe all of those tendencies. It's the same with jazz. Jazz is a language pretty much like any other, that blues, shred metal, neoclassic, whatever. The Van Halen style, the Ingve style, the Alan Holdsworth style, they would all have commonalities with the way this material is being presented. It's a vocabulary thing more than a technical book. It's like if you want to actually play like Joe Pass, there are Joe Pass licks in there.
sure.
If you talk about the blues, there would actually be blues licks that commonly found in jazz artists playing.
When I first learned guitar, I just learned some riffs and I didn't know what
Yeah,
chords I was playing, but it instilled in me the idea of the music versus I have to memorize every scale first, then I can write a solo. I went the other way and learned the licks first. So this seems to make a lot of sense.
and that actually goes right back to my mom because she didn't actually sit there and play scales. She was already playing repertoire. That's all I heard. I thought that's what music's supposed to sound like, not
Nice.
do 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 do.
Endless
She
scales.
could have done that, but if she would have done it, it would have been at hyper speed, and I wouldn't know what the heck it was. But she was already playing very complicated classical music with lots of chromatic notes and little embellishments and turns and trills and complicated chord voicings. So I never even heard scales until I first started taking music lessons. I didn't even know what a scale was. I'd been listening to music for probably 7 years before I even heard of a scale.
Isn't that strange? Well, I tell people, because I like to teach the way you're teaching here, when you're a kid, you don't learn the whole alphabet before you talk. You just start speaking words. And then you could figure out later how it all works. But, getting those words out, forming sentences, telling stories, that to me is the meat of it.
Yeah.
So it seems to be a good way to go.
I always tell my privates the difference is if you learn the alphabet, it's a difference between speaking or spelling everything.
Sure.
You write, okay, this is a Dorian mode, and I'm using this particular arpeggio. That's like spelling.
Yeah, that's a
You
good
learn a whole
analogy.
Van Halen lick that's like the first phrase of Eruption that runs through all those implied chord changes, and then you compare it to a John Coltrane line, just different kinds of harmony, but
Mhm.
really it's doing the same thing. It's a phrase that's idiomatic to that style,
Yes.
and you just accept that. I mean, that's why, to me, Yngwie Malmsteen wasn't that different than transcribing Pat Martino. It's like just it's a different form of the language, but they both use harmonic minor scales.
Sure. That makes sense. I mean, I could see why you're so successful as a transcriber from your origins and all the way through just tackling really difficult things. I mean, jazz. I heard one time, Steve, I had to transcribe Zappa tunes before.
Yeah,
That was one of those things.
like, hey, of course.
Yeah. Oh, it must have been insane. But imagine what that does. I mean, firsthand what that does to your brain once you tackle something like that. Everything else must seem a little bit easier.
Yeah, well, I was very fortunate to have a good background, and then I actually went to college and learned music theory the way
Sure.
it's taught at a university level at UCLA.
Yep.
So that helped me a lot with getting that together. But I never use that information when I teach guitar,
Isn't that
other than
funny?
just if somebody asks me about scales, I can tell them. And of course, there's plenty of scales covered in this book, but I don't dwell on it. It's immediately a scale becomes the music. Like a label, scale's like a label, and it's just like a bag of avocados. But how you make guacamole is really you're not just going to eat a bag of avocados. You eat beautifully prepared guacamole with chips, maybe the right seasoning. So
Oh,
it's like that. It's got to be shaped and formed. Well, I just want to commend you for having me come on. I appreciate that. I appreciate you giving me the time to cover my new venture and to kind of delve in the past. It's been a really a blast talking to you, and I hope that in some way it inspires some folks. That's what I originally got into all this music education for. It wasn't paying big money at Starlix, but it was the joy after I'd done private teaching to just spread out this information to a larger audience. So I'm
definitely.
hoping that this appearance on your show might have a similar payoff for people, that they get inspired to check other things out.
Well, I've always wanted to inspire people the way you inspired me just with this book alone. I mean, this thing changed my entire life. So, thank you very
So
much
nice.
for having a part of that.
Oh, my pleasure. And I know we didn't cover as much of the details of that book. So if you ever want to have me back and I'll talk specifically about just transcribing those kind of books, that's fine too, or anything else.
Okay,
Okay.
Wolf Marshall, I can't believe I'm talking to you still. This is crazy. I'm pinching myself. But thank you so much for your time, and let's do it again sometime.
Absolutely, Mike. It's been a pleasure to be with you.